So thank you again so much for having me. Thank you for such a lovely introduction. The paper that I chose to present today is actually a brand new. So I think I've only presented this paper once. And I decided to present this paper because I really, really like it. It's also new, so I'm still in love with it. It hasn't, been tormented too much through the review process. However, we just got a revision decision last week, I believe. And so the paper that you see today, and the reason why I haven't circulated the manuscript is because it will be most likely be modified and revised as it goes through the review process. However, you get to be part of my journey through publication. So any feedback that you give me on this is actually more likely to be integrated, to be useful, much more so than a perhaps more polished paper, however, that is basically already published and already done. So what I'll be talking about is working collaboration with my super good friends and co-authors, Luca Chan and Ellie Kyung. And what we do in this paper, we look at responses to artificial intelligence in the government. This is under review at Journal of Marketing Research, which is one of the premier outlets in my field, which is that of marketing. And I will unpack this in the next 40 minutes or so, but there are two things that I wanted to point your attention right off at the outset, which I really like about this paper. One is theoretically is we use a novel perspective because a lot of the work that I myself also has done in this area has looked at responses to AI in terms of investigating lay beliefs that people have about AI at the level of the individual agents. So typically we look at responses to AI in terms of what people believe that AI is capable or not capable of doing, benchmark to some human counterpart. And what we do in this paper is that instead of looking at beliefs about the individual AI agent, benchmarked at a human agent, we look at inferences based on group membership. So we look at the extent to which people generalize information learned about a single individual algorithmic or human agent to other members of that same group. So that perspective in itself is novel. And the second aspect of novelty is, as you were, I think, Anne-Marie hinting at, I was trained by hardcore German psychologists, but I'm also an applied person. And the substantive area of application of this work is that of the government and the public sector. And I was actually very surprised to find out that from a behavioral science perspective, there's actually very little being done in this area, especially if we take out, what we know from like economists or political science in terms of voting decisions on elections. But there is a lot of host of other dimensions of human behavior that are really not captured. And the government is such an interesting and unique setting because of the differences that it has with the private sector. And I'll try to point those differences out and feel free to ask me questions about that at the very end. So without further ado, let me dive into the crux of my talk. So let me put this topic in perspective. So if you're like me, when you heard the words artificial intelligence and government, you might have thought that I was talking about an oxymoron. And if so, you might be as surprised as I was to know that actually artificial intelligence is already being deployed in the government to quite a bit of an extent. So today, artificial intelligence is used to provide a core of public services to citizens. So it is used to allocate and adjudicate a number of government benefits and privileges, from disability to unemployment to social security benefits or even intellectual property rights. AI is also used to enforce the law and other regulatory mandates. So for instance, it's used in healthcare, but also in the judicial system. It is also used to monitor and analyze risks to public health and safety. Think about predictive policing or surveillance. And more generally, it's used to provide a number of services and to communicate these services to the public. And if you're curious about some numbers, they have conducted just a couple of years ago a survey of all the federal agencies in the United States. And what the survey has found out is that nearly half of them had already implemented and experimented with some AI system in the provision of these services. And in the last 3 years alone, the government has enacted a number of initiatives that were really intended to promote and accelerate and incentivize all public agencies to employ AI in the provision of their services. So this is all to say that much of the public sector and the government either has already been shaped by AI or will soon be done so. So why is that? What is the reason for this push towards implementing and deploying AI in the public sector? Well, the reasons are those that are often brought up when talking about AI, which is that AI promises to lower the cost and improve the quality, the consistency, the predictability of public agencies, which should in turn make them more effective and more efficacious in providing services to citizens, whose provision is the statutory duty of these agencies. So the next question is, well, is it so? Is that the case that AI is really making these agencies more effective and citizens more satisfied? And unfortunately, despite undeniable betterments in performance and despite technological leaps, these AI systems are fallible, so they might commit mistakes, many of which have been reported by the press in the recent years. So if you're doing work in this area, and this was something that was extremely helpful to us, there is actually an open source repository of all accidents related to automation, algorithms, and AI systems in the public sector, but also in the private sector. And you see, link it down below. If you can access the link, you can just Google this AI algorithmic and automation incident and controversy repository. But basically, just to give you some stats, in the last 3 years alone, the press has reported over 370 incidents related to AI, of which over nearly half happened in the public sector alone. And to give you some examples, what you see here is the case of an algorithm that had been utilized to recalculate disability benefits allocated to the residents of the state of Arkansas in the United States, that ended up cutting, terminating, or denying caregiver hours to these residents in violation of due process and without merit. And the same had happened by an automated system that was used to calculate fraud in unemployment insurance claimed for residents of the state of Michigan, which also brought tens of thousands of people to the brink of poverty because of failing calculations. And the final example that you see on the bottom right is something very similar that happened in the UK. So neither the phenomenon of AI in the government is specific and narrow, restricted to the United States, not, unfortunately, the phenomenon of failing algorithmic decisions in the public sector is, specific to the United States. But the very same thing happened to the US too. And this is just a snapshot of examples, but I wanted to bring those to your attention because we use this repository and also these 3 specific contexts as instruments in our studies. So in this context, these are the research questions that we started to investigate. And this is to look at one dimension of the social impact of AI in the government. And these are the questions. The number 1, first and foremost, how do consumers respond when learning of AI's failure? Number 2, what explains these responses? And number 3, what are the implications of these responses for a number of downstream consequences, which look at the propensity of people to utilize the public services? And before I lay out my predictions and before I dive into our empirical package, I wanted to briefly mention what prior research has identified in terms of these responses to AI's failures. And now I'm not going to give you an entire overview of, the really flourishing, and makes me happy to say so, research on either algorithm aversion or algorithm appreciation, but zooming in on responses to failures, we can sort of classify 2 buckets of research that have looked at these questions. And the first one is research which would classically fall under the umbrella of algorithm aversion or appreciation, that has looked at how, when learning of algorithmic failures, how do these does this learning changes reliance? And by reliance, I mean either stated or revealed preference when learning of failures. And what these researchers largely pointed to is that people tend to be indifferent between an algorithmic and a human advisor when under certain circumstances. So before learning of failures, people tend to be indifferent between relying on an algorithm or a human advisor if the performance of these relative advisors are unknown, if people are unfamiliar with the advisor, which often correlates with being unfamiliar with the performance, and depending on certain characteristics of the task. So typically when the task is impersonal and tends to be more objective. However, once people become familiar with the advisor and they observe or learn that the advisor has failed, then reliance on the algorithmic advisor decreases at a higher rate than reliance on the human advisor. And the motivations for that, the reasons for that are various. I'm sure you're familiar with that. They have to do with, again, lay beliefs of what the capability of the algorithmic advisor to learn from the mistakes, or other beliefs about the competencies or the capabilities of the advisor to fulfill the requirements of the task. Then there's a second stream of research that has kind of looked at this question of how do people respond when learning of AI's failures. That has to do not with reliance, but it has to do with moral judgments. And these researchers generally pointed to less negative responses to algorithmic than human failures. And this is the research, for instance, that has looked at brand harms or brand scandals, that has looked at incidents and accidents caused by automated vehicles, or has looked at responses to discrimination caused by algorithms. So again, for various explanations, these researchers pointed to milder responses to algorithmic than human failures. So in this context, what is the focus of our research? Well, we neither look at the former nor the latter. In other words, we neither look at changes in reliance nor at moral judgments in response to failures. Instead, what we focus on is a phenomenon that we label transference. So we look at the extent to which learning of a failure by algorithm A versus human A leads to inferring that a different algorithm, so algorithm B or human B, will also fail. And we focus on this phenomenon of transference because it's an inferential judgment, because it's an outcome variable that is a lot more commensurate with the context of our investigation, which is that of a public sector. So the public sector, like the private sector, is a context where people's provision of sort of choice is much more restricted. So if you think in the private sector, if you want to utilize a very abstract framework of exit or voice, which explains how people respond to companies or firms or other agents' behaviors, it's in the private sector, it's much more easier for people to switch company or to, for instance, choose to interact with a person or with an algorithm. And these choices are much more restricted in the public sector, a context where people are not typically in charge to choose whether they want to interact with an algorithm or with a human. So if you think of a typical application, which could be an algorithm checking for fraud, citizens cannot choose whether it's going to be an algorithm or a person that's going to check or disburse their unemployment insurance claims. Or in the judicial sector, a citizen cannot choose whether an algorithm or a judge will determine their bail and so forth. This is not to say that the phenomenon that we identify and investigate and the explanation that we propose can only be applied to the public sector, but it's rather the other way around. So definitely there are many of the explanations that have been proposed in the private sector that cannot be transferred here, but the reverse is certainly possible. In other words, both this transference and the explanation that we give is something that can be applied to the private sector as well. So this caveat aside, what are our predictions? So our first assumption is that when presented with failures of an algorithm of a person, people will spontaneously and naturally categorize other humans as in-groups, groups to which people themselves belong to, and other non-human social agents, such as AI algorithms, as outgroups. And this is based on social identity theory, so these very fundamental ways in which people categorize spontaneously other social agents as in-groups, meaning as members of a group to which they themselves belong to, or as outgroups, members to groups to which they themselves do not belong to. And this is sort of something that is our basic assumption. It's not something that we actually provide evidence. And one of the things that they're requiring us to do for this revision is actually to provide evidence of that. So if you have any ideas or thoughts on how we can do that, we would certainly welcome, hearing these ideas. But this is sort of our fundamental assumptions. And then, as a consequence of that, we suggest is the manifestation of a phenomenon that is known in social categorization work, which is that of outgroup homogeneity, which is the tendency for people to perceive that outgroups are less variable than in-groups. So we tend to perceive outgroups as less differentiated, as more homogeneous, less variables than in-groups. And this is a phenomenon that has been documented in social categorization research across a number of naturally occurring groups, such as race, religion, nationality, and profession. So we expect the very same thing to happen. In other words, we expect people to naturally categorize AI systems as outgroups, and therefore to view them as a group of less heterogeneity or greater homogeneity than a comparable group of other human beings. As a consequence of that, in other words, because AIs are viewed as a highly homogeneous group, we predict that information about one AI is transferred to another member of the same group, so another AI, at a higher rate than information about a member of a more heterogeneous group, in other words, than a person. So this is our basic effect that we refer to as algorithmic transference, which is greater generalization of algorithmic than human information, which is explained by greater homogeneity perception of a group of algorithms compared to a group of humans. So this is, in essence, our theoretical framework. So we systematically manipulate the source of the failure, so whether the failing agent is an AI or a human, and our outcome variable of interest in inferential judgment and the downstream consequences. And our explanation is one of group homogeneity. And before laying out our empirical package, at least as it stands with the current version of the paper, I wanted to make two more, I wanted to point your attention to a couple of things, because I really want to be really careful and not overclaim. Number one, the effect of this perception of group homogeneity and therefore algorithmic transference is inaccurate. So the perception that AI systems are undifferentiated and are all the same is actually not something grounded in reality. These agencies and public agencies, there's really a lot of heterogeneity in whether they contract out to third-party developers the development of these systems or whether they develop these systems in-house. So it's actually a miscalibration or inaccurate beliefs that these systems are equal. To the extent to which humans that carry out this task are heterogeneous, that should very much carry over to cases in which these tasks are carried out by automated systems. The second point is less substantive and actually a lot more theoretical. Our predictions do not implicate nor oppose algorithm aversion. So you can explain our results without having to implicate a sort of preconceived antipathy towards algorithms. However, that does not mean that we negate that algorithm aversion exists and it might actually interact with our effect. And there's going to be a study that I'll speak about that speaks to this point, where the results cannot be explained by algorithm aversion, and then I'll show you, hopefully if I have time, a study in which we show the scope of the effect, so a boundary condition, which is predicated also on implication of algorithm aversion or dislike for automated systems. So this is a very overwhelming slide that depicts the empirical package as it currently stands. I think we have 11 or 12 studies in the paper. I feel like someday I will have a paper where I have actually 20 studies in the paper. But fear not, I will not be presenting them all, also because this empirical package will most likely be revised But roughly speaking, it's divided into three parts. The first sort of column to the left is evidence of the main effect, so evidence of algorithmic transference. Then the second part of the paper zooms in onto our proposed explanation of the effect via mediation, via moderation. I don't know if you are fans of mediation. Personally, I'm not, but the field that I'm housed in has a bit of a tendency to expect that, so we have to provide that. But we try and always manipulate our explanation and delineate the scope of the effect. So you might be more pleased by these studies than by a straightforward mediation study. And I'll show you evidence of that. And then the latter part of the paper looks at downstream implications for consumer behavior and for policy. So let me dive in. So the very first three studies had a very simple goal, which is to provide evidence of algorithmic transference across samples. So we looked at a convenience sample, we looked at a nationally representative sample, and then we looked at a sample of experts, people that for whom a certain degree of knowledge about algorithm can be presumed. And we wanted to do so relying on real cases of application of AI. Throughout the paper, it was really important for us for external validity purposes to test cases where we didn't want to test sci-fi kind of cases. We wanted to test cases where AI is today used in the government, in the public sector. And to do so, there is another useful link for us, at least at the very bottom of this page, which is basically I think it's updated within no later than the last 2 years. That details all the cases of use of AI in the government. So this was extremely useful for us, and feel free to use it for you as well. We also, for external validity, we took our instruments were all based on real news articles that appeared on various news outlets that reported the AI failure. So what we did was basically, we took the article, which was about the reporting of a failure of an algorithm in the provision of a certain type of public service. And then we built the control condition, which was the reporting of the same failure, this time caused by a person. So in study 1A, we used the domain was that of the calculation of disability benefits in the state of Arkansas, and we used a convenience sample. So participants read the article about the failure of either the algorithm or the human. And then in another study, we used social security benefits calculation in the UK. So we wanted to see what happens when the domain of investigation is not the very same of the population that we recruited, but it comes from a foreign country. And this time we also used recruited a nationally representative sample from Prolific. We also used Lucid in some of the other studies. And finally, in the third study, we used the determination of fraud in unemployment benefit claims in the state of Michigan. And we recruited a sample of experts from a special screening settings on cloud research. And we recruited respondents who indicated computer science, engineering, and high tech as their field of training or current work. And I'll come to this point in the next study that I'll talk about, because we wanted to see whether the effect that we are hypothesizing and testing would only hold true for people that have a low degree of understanding and knowledge about algorithm. So one of the ways in which we test that was to recruit people that one could assume would have, roughly speaking, a sort of a higher understanding and knowledge of algorithms than sort of an average layman, an average person. So the setup was identical in all of these studies, and the DV was also identical, and it will be the very same that we capture throughout all of the studies, which is that we ask participants to make an inferential judgment about the likelihood that a different algorithm or a different person employed by a different governmental agency would fail. So throughout the studies, we identified the algorithm source of the failure and the algorithm for which we ask people to make an inference by the state in which it was employed. So we ask about Arkansas and Kentucky, we ask about United Kingdom and Arkansas, and then we ask about Michigan and state of residence. And what you see here are the results. And so it's plotted on the y-axis, there's this inferential judgment, and higher number implicate higher inference of failure. as a function of the sample population that we tested, the type of domain. And you see that across all of these cases, people were more prone to think that a different algorithm would fail than they would think that a different person would also fail. And also, side note, I know we are not typically in the business of looking at effect sizes, sadly, but I was also surprised that this effect is actually quite sizable in terms of its effect size. So the next set of studies are intended to provide support of our explanation for this the effect of algorithmic transference, which is at a group homogeneity perception, while also testing out and ruling out other potential explanation as the main driver of the effect. Another bit of a disclaimer, but I think this is important to notice, is that I don't believe that there are few and probably no things in social sciences that are as powerful as gravity as accounting for the sole explanation. We do not mean to claim the group homogeneity perception is the sole explanation of this effect, but it is a parsimonious driver when other explanations are taken into account, either by manipulation or by measurement. So what is the goal of studies 2? Is to test perceptions of group homogeneity as processed via an analysis of mediation. And we also wanted to test 2 alternative explanations that might have also popped up in your minds. One is based on locus of causality of the failure. So it is possible that transference, or in a sense, higher prediction of failure of the algorithm, could be due to different attribution of the failure. So people could be attributing the failure of the algorithm to causes that are more internal to the algorithm, and therefore more stable and therefore more likely to be repeated for another algorithm, compared to their attribution of the failure by a human being, which could be explained and attributed to causes external to the person. So people might be thinking that a person making a determination of fraud in Michigan might be having a bad day and therefore they might fail, and the person in Arkansas is not going to have as likely to have a bad day and therefore less likely to make the mistake. So what we do in this study, we measure locus of causality and test that out as an alternative explanation. Another one, and I mentioned that already, is an explanation based on subjective understanding of the algorithm. I myself have a paper on that. So there's this tendency for people to believe they can introspect, and there's this illusory understanding of how a fellow human being makes a decision, whereas algorithms are perceived as more opaque, as more black boxes. And this perceived opacity or lower subjective understanding of algorithm may also account for the results. And so we measure this alternative explanation in this study as well. And Marie, do you have a question? Is that a hand? No. Okay. And finally, also, something that we didn't do in the previous study because we took real news articles in the way that they were written. But in the next studies, we controlled for sort of expectations or base rates of accuracy by specifying the failure rate for both the algorithm and the human in the instruments that we use. So let me show you how the setup is fairly simple and straightforward. Participants again read an article about the failure of either an algorithm or a human. This time it was in the calculation of unemployment benefits, and that information includes base rates of the accuracy of the calculation. And then we measure the following 4 variables in this order. The first one is our main dependent variable, inferential judgments, measured exactly the same as I showed you for the first studies. Then we measure our proposed mediator of interest. We ask people to think about the algorithms or the people that perform tasks as the one that we described across agencies and states across the country. And we ask them to rate them the extent to which they believe these algorithms or people to share common underlying characteristics, to be most likely very similar to each other in terms of their characteristics, and to resemble one another in terms of their characteristics and capabilities. And then we measure locus of causality by attributing the failure of the calculation either to the algorithm or the person or to external circumstances. And then we measure subjective understanding by asking them the extent to which they thought that the algorithm or the person, the participants understood the way in which the algorithm or the person made these calculations. And what you see here are the results. As you see, we replicate algorithmic transference greater inference than another algorithm, then another person would also fail. You see that also group homogeneity perception conform to our hypothesis. So people naturally thought about the algorithms as more homogeneous than a group of people. And you see also effect size in this case is huge compared to what I'm used to seeing. And neither locus of causality nor subjective knowledge was significant, although directionally the means were conforming to the results. And again, if you're into this kind of test, whereas group homogeneity perception mediated the observed effects on the dependent variable, neither locus of causality nor subjective understanding mediated the effect. I wanted to make a side note, and then I'll proceed talking about another study because I think it might be useful, hopefully, for some of you. The way in which we are modifying this study is actually improving on the measurement of knowledge of algorithms. So what we are doing here, we are not actually measuring objectively how much people know about algorithms. We are measuring subjective knowledge, how much people feel like they know about algorithm. So it still remains unanswered whether an explanation that's predicated on people simply not knowing much about algorithm is actually a viable alternative explanation. And it's something that the reviewers asked us to do, and we were very happy to comply. And actually, that's where we started with our revision. So what we wanted to do is the most straightforward way of testing this hypothesis is to see whether objective knowledge of algorithms or algorithmic literacy correlates with our effect. So we looked in the literature for a measure of that, and we couldn't find one. So we developed our own. And we were, excited and a little bit worried because we didn't want to develop a measure that would be so hard that nobody would get it right, or so easy that everybody will look like a super experts of algorithm. So we put together a test made of, I think there are 20 items about, it's a multiple choice question, only one of the answers is correct and the others are wrong. 10 items measure knowledge of AI and 10 items measure knowledge of algorithms. And we piloted that, and actually we are really happy about the distribution of the results. So it's normal-ish how people in the from the population from which we typically recruit from answer to these questions. And we piloted in a test in which we do a study that's exactly the same as the one that I just showed you. So failure of an algorithm or a human, we measure our DV, we measure our group homogeneity perception, and then people take this quiz about algorithmic literacy. And what we found is actually that the results are completely uncorrelated with how people perform on the quiz. So this study that I just showed you will be most likely replaced. This was a pilot, so now we are going to pre-register that, and actually we want to rerun it for like about 2.5 times the sample size. So really put it to the test. If you are interested in this measure of algorithmic literacy, if you want to help us validate it, really welcome that. Or if you're interested in any of the stimuli also, just shoot me an email. We will be making everything available on OSF. It's just that I guess to a certain extent, any journal does that, but in a marketing journal, papers go through quite substantial revisions. We're just not comfortable having too many versions of the paper laying around. But again, feel free to, ask me either of these measure or the other one. So I'm gonna quickly move to the next study. I want to talk about briefly about two more studies. One, I'm not going to go into the details. This is a study in which instead of measuring group homogeneity perception, we actually manipulate it. It's a fairly straightforward interaction study in which orthogonal to agent, we make explicitly to people, we basically give them information that the group of algorithms or the group of human are actually heterogeneous. So we use verbiage that's very similar to our mediator. This time we put it in the instruments. And you see that here that actually that study, when heterogeneity of the group was made salient, eliminated transference. And I also wanted to point your attention to the comparison between the human in the control condition and the AI when group heterogeneity was made salient. And these two inferences are not significantly different from each other. And that result is at odds with an explanation predicated on algorithm aversion. The reason being that if you are still averse to algorithms, in your inference, you should not be, you should not make a difference whether you think the algorithms are different or not. You simply should reject algorithms by default. But the study that I wanted to briefly mention is a different study that actually is not very meaningful from a theoretical perspective. But as a researcher in this area, I wanted to share because I finally found a scale, an individual level difference that correlates with algorithm aversion over these effects. And if you're like me and you struggle to find something that sometimes can come very handy in the publishing of a paper, I wanted to share this scale with you. So this is a subset of a scale that is called Technology Readiness Index, which, as you can imagine from the name, it just captures people's propensity to embrace technology and adopt technology. It's about technology broadly construed. So it can be about AI just as much as it is about an ATM machine or a computer. And there are, I think, 5 subsets of this scale. And the only one that correlates robustly, actually all the others, I'm saying robustly not because the others sometimes will correlate. The others were completely not internally reliable and also uncorrelated. But the subset that captures discomfort with new technologies was really highly and robustly correlated with this effect. So you might find this scale useful, and if so, I will have been happy to have shared this with you. But what we find is that this scale is related to transference. So the more people are discomfort with technologies, the greater their transfer of an algorithmic failure to a different algorithm. And remember the point that I made briefly at the very beginning. This study speaks to sort of the overlap of this effect, which is in its nature due to the way in which people mentally represent a group of algorithms. But there's also a part of it that has to do with just general antipathy, general fear and concern for algorithms. And I think this interaction of algorithmic transference with this discomfort with technology speaks to this point. So I have probably 0 minutes. So let me just conclude talking about the contribution of this work to theory and to practice. So again, from a theoretical perspective and to the broad research on psychological responses to automated systems, this paper in its, if I were to distill the contribution of this paper to this kind of research, is on 2 dimensions. One is that we look at effects that are due to social categorization and perceptual processes due to the way in which people perceive and mentally represent a group of non-human social agents, which is as a group of greater homogeneity than a comparable group of people. And that is different because most prior research, including my own, has looked at responses to AI and algorithm at the level of beliefs at the individual agent. We also look at the consequences of this categorization process, and looking at inference is also novel compared to looking at reliance as by way of state or revealed preference. It's also novel substantively from the perspective of decision-making in the public sector. And there's a lot of, this is not to say that there's no research done on that domain, but it's typically done from the perspective of the strength or the weakness of AI in the public sector, rather than looking at the potential of AI, rather than looking at how will consumers respond to that. And if you think about it, that it should be an integral and necessary dimension to look at when considering the social impact of AI, in citizen in the life of the public. And very proudly, I'm only going 1 minute over the time, so I'm going to end here. Feel free to shoot me or any of my wonderful co-authors a question if you have any suggestion, any questions, or if you want to access any of the data or stimuli for this project. And I thank you for your attention, for bearing with me with my very cracking voice. Let's stop talking here. Thank you.